As we start to discuss the post-classical Chinese dynasties, and remember we're giving a rough time frame of this post-classical period in world history from around the year 600 to around the year 1450, maybe, I don't know. We want to remind ourselves of this very helpful Chinese dynasty song, a song that you guys will be sitting at your exam table in May, and there will be some question that will pop up, and you will, in your own head, don't sing it out loud, you will, in your own mind, sing this out. So let's remind ourselves of what we got here. It is to the tune of Where is Thumbkin? Or Frere Jacques. You like that better? Okay. Here we go. A 1 and a 2 and a you know what to do. And now, yeah, this is the original version. I've tweaked it a little myself. I don't make these things. I just copy them from the internet. This is the original version. I kind of tweaked that last little line to Mao and Deng to remember another guy that we're going to want to know by the end of the year, a guy named Deng Xiaoping. So I break it up between Mao and Deng Xiaoping. But regardless, for us, we care most about these dynasties. Today we're going to talk about the Sui and the Tang and the Song, and I like that the Sui and the Tang and the Song all fit into their own little stanza because they all fit into their own time period in history. Although we are going to be bringing in the Yuan dynasty in another day. So Sui, Tang, Song, and then the Mongol Yuan dynasty are all part of the post-classical era. We're going to mention these. We want to remember those dynasties, and we want to remember their names. I don't care necessarily that you remember the specific numbers or the dates that these dynasties ruled, but we should remember that Shang is the oldest because it comes first in the song. We don't know much about the Shang dynasty. And then the Zhou dynasty, that was that first millennium before the Common Era, where China was pretty loosely organized. There wasn't a strong centralized state. And then the Qin dynasty was the empire that brought it all together, right? And remember the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, the first emperor of a unified China? Qin Shi Huangdi, very good. And we're going to remember, was that a long-lived or a very short-lived dynasty? Short-lived. Very short-lived. And then the Han, yeah, just him, really. We got about 20 years. Then the Han dynasty. This is the classical Chinese dynasty, about 400 years of relative peace and prosperity. Well, peace within the dynasty, a lot of conflict as they expanded. And then about 400 years. And we want to make note of what 400 years is in the scope of history, right? And I love to think about 2015 and take us 400 years before us to 1615. That's before pilgrims were arriving in the Americas. So this is a long-lived dynasty, the Han dynasty. And then the Han dynasty falls. It loses its centralization. Okay, it's not going to be a complete fall of the Han rulers will still be there, but they won't be controlling a massive empire or this massive Chinese dynasty. We have now China returning to an era of decentralization, all right, and division. About another 400-year period where you don't have that strong central entity in China, all right? And then we have the rebirth of strong centralized dynasties. So this gets us to remember that Chinese history is cyclical in nature. Okay, we've got a dynasty that will come in and rule. They will have this mandate of heaven. We want to associate that with the Chinese dynasties. They have this mandate of heaven, which says the gods think that these people are equipped to rule because they're doing the right things by their people, and eventually they're not going to do the right things, and the gods will take away the mandate of heaven, and those dynasties will fall until some other dynasty is granted the mandate of heaven. And then things are good, because when now you're new and you take over, you're vibrant, you want to put the state back together, you do all the things that a successful dynasty would want, or a successful emperor would want to do, like building projects and expanding and protecting your borders and establishing granaries. This word comes up in the last chapter that you read, these granaries, storehouses for grain. right? So you've got, in the good times when you're producing a lot, you store a lot of that away for the lean times that might be coming in the future. When dynasties are good, when kingdoms are good, they think ahead like that. When they start to weaken, they may not focus on those kinds of things. And then when the lean times come, there's not enough food to go around. And then people suffer, and then people protest, and protests sometimes result in dynasties being overthrown, and then that cycle has to start itself up over again. We should remember all this stuff. Yes?
The Chinese have a mandate of heaven, but they believe in Buddhism and Confucianism. Why do they believe in that God?
Yeah. Good question. So the question is so we got this notion of a mandate of heaven, but then what about Buddhism that's going to come in during the late Han Dynasty? What about the Confucianism that's always there? I think this is a common theme that we're going to see in Eastern religions, or in Eastern spiritual beliefs. They don't have to be all-encompassing. When we talk about Christianity or Judaism or Islam, we consider those universal religions in that anybody can beat it, but it is my way or the highway, all right? So anybody can become a Christian, anybody can become a Muslim, but once you do, you accept a worldview that doesn't allow for a lot of variance, right? In Eastern faiths, we see this in Hinduism, that allows, that can coexist with Buddhism in India. And we see it with religions in East Asia, whether it be Japan or China. We'll talk about Japan in our next class, that are able to commingle and exist at the same time. There's a lot more openness to variances in beliefs. So you can be Buddhist, but still kind of ascribe to this notion of heavenly beings. And Buddhism also, especially as it makes its way into China, kind of becomes a godly religion, that they are allowing this to exist. So there's a lot more this commingling of beliefs. Yes, sir?
I think when they say the mandate of heaven, the person who is giving the mandate of heaven is usually referred as, it's not, I wouldn't necessarily call it a god, but in the dynasties, we would call it's just a supernatural being who it's not like a deity or anything,
right.
But it's just somebody way up there. Even the name for that person is not the same as Buddha in
Okay.
Buddhism. It actually just sky. It's in Vietnamese. It translates directly to sky. So it's somebody up there. We don't know, but it's all powerful. So I think if you link that, it's that person gives the mandate of heaven, but that is not to be confused with Buddhism or anything else. But it's just somebody that people.
But they can coexist at the same time.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have something to add to that.
Absolutely.
I mentioned that origin. So, yes, there is no God. There's pretty much there's no central God because our religion was Buddhism and Taoism and what was the other one we called? It was there was one more, right? Buddhism, Taoism, and the other one was.
Well, we talked about we talked about legalism,
there's
but
no
but
unified religion. There's no
yeah.
unified religion.
Yeah.
So there is no deity that we specifically worship.
Right.
It's just that literally what the word we use for it is Lao Tian Ye, which literally translates to old sky grandfathers.
Sounds very.
Yeah,
Look at this.
It just literally translates to sky. So it's just there's no being. It's just a force. It's just there.
Awesome.
It's just up there.
Beautiful.
There's
Thank
no
you.
need that you know how you said legitimacy.
Yes.
For the Eastern Roman
Yeah.
Empire and all that.
Yeah.
We didn't really need legitimacy. It's everybody was pretty much used to that. And plus, you said Eastern religions weren't tolerant. So.
Absolutely. Okay, so we want to remind ourselves, and now we just heard him, of these traditional Chinese beliefs that had long been in existence by the time we get to this era. Ideas of Taoism, like a native Chinese religion born in the very early classical period, around the year 600 BCE. Remember Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. We talked about some political ideologies like legalism and Confucianism. And then, of course, Buddhism entering into China during the late, and growing in China just as the Han Dynasty is starting to fall, right? So we want to remember these as we talk about what we're getting into. After the fall of the Han, we're going to go through about 4 centuries of decentralization and decline in Chinese civilization. And this is known as the period of the 6 dynasties. We will not talk about the 6 dynasties or any names. It's just, hey, now we have one unified China that's broken up into many.
So there's 400 years. How
About 400 years, from about the year 220 to about the year 589, or to the year 589, when the Sui dynasty rises. We're going to see the elaborate bureaucracy that was established by the Han dynasty. We're going to see that fall apart. It's going to be gone. That scholar gentry class that was so elevated during the Han dynasty, that's going to be gone. And power in China will now return to where does power always go when centralized authority is gone? Not the people. Local landlords, the rich guys that own the land, right? So when in the absence of a centralized bureaucracy, now guys, are we picking up this trend, right? When we have a strong central state, we have in many cases emperors that have to keep the landed aristocracy, the rich guys, in check, all right? We have to make sure that they don't have too much power. Sometimes we do that brutally, right? Sometimes we do it by handing out political positions and whatnot. So when there is a strong centralized state, you tend to have weak landlords. When there are weak landlords, or strong landlords, you have a weak centralized state. Mr. Dobie. Hey. Can you come in a little bit? Awesome, thank you. Bye-bye. Counselor, when you need, when I'm done here. So this is the period of 6 dynasties. We will see Buddhism grow tremendously during this period. This is when Buddhism becomes the prominent ideological belief in China.
When is it?
During this, from the years 220, the fall of the Han, to about 589, the rise of the Sui. So Buddhism will supplant Confucianism. This should make a lot of sense, though, because what is Confucianism all about? It's a philosophy for government with strong order and a strong centralized hierarchy, right? You've got an emperor, you've got the bureaucrats that carry out the emperor's orders. Well, in the absence of that, it doesn't surprise us then that Confucianism itself will start to take a backseat and a new belief system might come in and replace that, and that will be Buddhism. And generally we see in this period in Chinese history, because there isn't that strong centralized bureaucracy, we see a general decline in trade activity, in technological development, in intellectual activity, like literature and philosophy and such, and in cities. Cities that were once large and powerful and pretty wealthy during the Han Dynasty will fall into decline.
So these are 4 things.
You guys could come up with these on your own. When a society starts to decline, what kinds of things go away? The same will be true for every society we've talked about. There's going to be urban decline. There's going to be less intellectual activity. There's going to be less trade over long distances. Because who maintains the roads over long distances?
The government.
The strong centralized state, right? And in the absence of that, why is this landlord over here going to give some of his wealth to that landlord over there to help him maintain his roads? It ain't going to happen. So all of the things that a state does, and we've talked a lot about that for all these different states, when that state disappears, those things fall into disrepair. Everyone good? Good. Now we're going to bring it back. Let's talk about the restoration of the Chinese state. This begins with the Sui dynasty, S-U-I, Sui dynasty. Roughly 581 to 618, but I would never expect you guys to memorize those years. So if we can just say the Sui dynasty, round about the year 600, and that's really convenient because this whole post-classical era that we've been talking about now for weeks starts around the year when? 600. So what a great time to start this for China, right? So round about the year 600, and then 589 to 618, long time or short time in the scope of the history that we've talked about. This is very short. This is Qin-esque in its length, right? The Qin and the Qin dynasty and the Sui dynasty are going to have a lot in common that we can talk about, all right? So 589 to 618, we get the Sui dynasty in China. That's the green chunk that you see here, the green chunk that we see here. And a new emperor, a guy named Wen or Wen Di. You guys remember Qin Shi Huang Di? The D is like emperor. All right? So Wen Di is going to be the first emperor, or Wen is going to be the first emperor of the Sui dynasty. W-E-N. Pretty easy there. He's going to win control of northern China. This dynasty comes out of northern China and will expand to the south. And he grows in strength. The Sui dynasty will grow in strength as the people within this kingdom, will experience lower tax burdens. Remember, even when the empire is gone, they're still paying taxes. They're just paying it to a local landlord rather than to a centralized state. So individuals will experience lower taxes. The government will start some construction projects that will have a massive impact on the Chinese state. We'll talk about that in a moment. The Sui dynasty will reestablish granaries that were long left to disrepair. Granaries to store grains for lean years. Yeah. No, when we're done, you get time. The most massive construction project in Chinese history after the building of the Great Wall of China is going to be developed by this Sui dynasty, and that's called the Grand Canal. And in fact, I got a better picture of it here. The Grand Canal. From the north of China, connecting the Yangtze River to the Yangtze River in the south. So it's going to connect northern China, that's where the Sui dynasty originated, to the southern part of China, the Yangtze River, where the Sui dynasty would expand to. The Grand Canal. You can see a modern picture of a small portion of it here. Yes, ma'am? The Great Wall was begun during the Qin dynasty, but every Chinese dynasty has to keep working at the Great Wall to expand it, to repair it. So like the Great Wall that you see today, when you see pictures of the Great Wall of China, is actually mostly constructed during the Ming dynasty in around the 1600s. But the original Great Wall was Qin China. So this is a picture of the Grand Canal in China today. Hugely important for Chinese development. Because now, so here we have some like interstate trade going on. The northern portion of China was mostly a wheat-producing portion of China. The southern portion of China was mostly a rice-producing portion of China. And now with the Grand Canal, there can be an exchange of those two crops, two commodities. This is huge because when there is a weak year for wheat, they might be able to supplement that with rice. Or vice versa. So the Grand Canal is going to be the most massive construction project in China since the development of the Great Wall of China, and a huge asset developed by the Sui dynasty. So we're going to, of course, see the expansion of the Chinese state, and a return of the scholar gentry and Confucian teachings. Now, these guys are all Buddhists still. All right, Buddhism has now taken a hold in China, so the leaders of Sui China are Buddhists, but they recognize we are now in charge of a strong, or what we want to be a strong centralized state. And in China, at least, what kind of ideology makes for the strongest, most centralized states? Confucianism. Confucianism. Let's bring back the order, let's bring back the hierarchies. And so the Sui dynasty brings back the examination system. They redevelop the scholar gentry to create a new class of bureaucrats that can carry out the orders of the day. And again, strong centralized state, weak landlords. The scholar gentry might come from the rich landed class, but anybody can enter to it, anybody of skill. It's an absolute meritocracy. Now that said, what kind of people have the most ability to read and study? The wealthy people. But you will see others coming in. Yes, ma'am?
How did this, why did this start, okay, so I understand that it started around 600
Yeah.
CE. So
600 CE.
CE.
Yes.
Why did they want this? Why did they want to restore it? Did something happen where they...
Yeah, okay, so the guy who became Emperor Wen, or Wen Di, he was one of these powerful landlords, right? And he's fighting against other powerful landlords, and he wins, just like Qin Shi Huangdi did 800 years before. So he wins, and he starts defeating and bringing the other powerful landlords under his control. And once he has his empire, he's going to reestablish Confucianism, reestablish the scholar gentry, because who does he want in charge of local communities? The scholar gentry that are under him, not the powerful landlords that could threaten him. So yeah, it's the same way rich landlords in Western Europe eventually become kings. They become more powerful than the landlords next door to them, and they control them. And then they can control more and more and more. They effectively create monopolies of power, right? Good. Good. Now, the Sui dynasty is not without its faults. It's a double negative. It means they had some problems, all right? The Sui dynasty's got some issues. They are known in Chinese history as being a brutally harsh and repressive empire. And that, again, reminds us of the Qin dynasty, right? These guys were very tough on the populace. Sadly, it kind of makes sense. They create some massive building projects. What do you need for massive building projects? You need labor. Now, we're not going to call them slave labor, but they're basically going to be conscripted labor or drafted labor. Just like some of you young men, hopefully not, but are going to have to register for the draft, and you might be forced to serve in the American military at some point. In China, when you need to build a great wall or expand a great wall or dig a grand canal, and guys, can we wrap our heads around this? Like, do you remember in 8th grade history you learned about the digging of the Erie Canal? No, okay. Or did you know that around about the same time, about 150 years ago, there was work begun to dig a canal from Lake St. Clair across to Lake Michigan? And that's why we have a road in our community called Canal Road. It went right along that canal. Yeah, there you go. That's where you came from. And you can still, on the side of the canal road, you can still see, wow, they have a really big ditch on the side of their road. Well, that's the old canal. There are signs. You could go to the big library in Clinton Township and see a big mural about how that was supposed to work. They never finished it, right? Because in the 1800s, that was like too hard and too expensive and not deemed worthwhile. But in the 600s, China does this. And you can imagine, without modern engineering, right? And so you can imagine the manpower that this is going to take. That can only be orchestrated by a strong, centralized state. And it can only be orchestrated in this time by being pretty rough on your citizens. All right? So, in addition to being pretty harsh and repressive against its populace, they will also face threats from outsiders. There's always northern nomadic peoples that are trying to get some of the riches of the Chinese state. The Great Wall of China is meant to keep them out, but it's not always successful. But ultimately, it's internal revolts, it's internal uprisings that bring the Sui dynasty to a fall. And we will have in the year 907, in the year 618, in the year 618, we have the fall of the Sui dynasty. The Sui emperor is going to be killed, and he is going to be replaced by a new dynasty called the Tang dynasty. Founded by a guy named Li Yuan, Liyuan. That's probably a name you're never going to have to remember again. Founded by a guy named Li Yuan in 618, the Tang dynasty will rule China for almost 300 years until 907. Now again, we want to step back and think about years. 300 years, a long time? Oh yes, that's a very long time, right? You take us from 300 years to 1715. We aren't a country yet, okay? We are like a couple generations away from being a country. 300 years is a long time. The Tang dynasty will see tremendous expansion, okay? Bigger expansion than China has done to this point, all the way into Tibet, into Manchuria and Mongolia, into Vietnam, eventually into northern Korea. The Tang dynasty will experience tremendous expansion. But like other great empires that expanded tremendously, holding on to all that territory, especially over people that don't want to be dominated by outsiders, that's expensive. And eventually that leads to the Tang downfall itself, creating such a massive empire. Can you guys think of any other empires that we've talked about? Roman Empire is a good example, sure. Persians have a hard time holding on to a massive empire. The Byzantine Empire has a hard time holding on to a massive empire. The Umayyad Caliphate has a hard time holding on to a massive empire. They all do. It's not easy. The Tang dynasty, this is going to usher in what is known to Chinese history as the golden age of China, from the Tang to the Song to the Yuan dynasty. This is like the high point of Chinese civilization and society. They will work on repairing the Great Wall of China. They will continue to strengthen that Confucian bureaucracy, strengthening the scholar gentry, enhancing and growing the examination system that plucks those scholars out of Chinese society. And again, as we strengthen the bureaucracy, what are we weakening? The landlords that might pose a threat to the central state. Also crucially important to talk about during the Tang dynasty, and also in the political development of China, is what's going to happen to Buddhism. All right? Now we talked, Buddhism has its rise with the fall of the Han dynasty. The Sui dynasty, they're Buddhists. In the early Tang dynasty, those rulers are Buddhist. All right? Your book mentions this Empress Wu. Okay? All right, we're excited about that. Tang Empress Wu in the early years of the Tang dynasty is going to mark the high point of Buddhism within China. But as time passes by and as Empress Wu will be gone, there begins to be pressure from the Tang state and the bureaucrats within to start to push Buddhism back. And a new class called the Neo-Confucians, the Neo-Confucians will begin to attempt to restrict Buddhism within China. Because it's very interesting, Buddhism in China during the early Tang dynasty, during the Sui dynasty, has some of the same benefits as religions do in the United States today. Does anybody know any political or economic benefit that religions in the United States today have?
Freedom.
Okay, you're free to preach and practice how you want, but I think I heard it over here. How so? Okay, well, they might. I mean, if they buy a building or rent a building, they might have to pay rent. But what about taxes? What's in the United States? What's the status of churches and taxes? Yes, ma'am. Churches don't pay tax. They're tax-exempt institutions. All right. No, they don't pay more. They in fact don't pay any. And this bothers a lot of people in modern society, because churches absolutely bring in a lot of money, all right, in people's donations and such. And obviously churches do a lot of good works with that money, but they also fund their own operations and their buildings and such. And they are exempt from federal income taxes. All right? And Buddhism, in the Buddhist monasteries and the Buddhist temples in China 1,000 years ago, were also exempt from such taxes of the state, because Buddhism was long supported by the government. But as we see the growth of the Tang dynasty and the reassertion of Confucianism in China, these neo-Confucianists, these new Confucianists, begin to see that as problematic. Because you have a lot of Chinese wealth that is going untaxed within the lands and the incomes of Buddhist monasteries and temples. So there will begin to be a backlash against Buddhism in China by the Tang Dynasty. And these Neo-Confucians want to reestablish their authority within the state, with emphasis on rank and ritual and obligation to the Chinese state, rather than to a Buddhist faith. We will all, yes, sir?
So you said they kind of went backlash against Buddhism because they like the Buddhists, what was it called? They got supported by the government.
Primarily economic, reasons. Yes.
And what was the economic reason? You said
Tax exemption. They didn't have to pay taxes. So if you had a home and you owned some property, you paid taxes on it. If you had a business, you paid taxes. But if you were a Buddhist monastery, the monastery didn't pay taxes. And as Buddhism was so powerful and influential in China, that's going to be a lot of money that the Chinese government can't get its hands on until the Neo-Confucians push back. Yes? Why not just tax them? That's ultimately what the push is, yeah. But now that once you start having, like once the Buddhist monasteries, once they start having to pay, well, they'll shrink. They won't be as powerful as they once were.
So the Neo-Confucianists, they want to do that?
Yeah.
They end up doing what? They end up pushing
Weakening Buddhism within China. Another thing that we're going to see with the rise of the Neo-Confucianists in China. Oh, here's a little picture of the examination system up and running again. Look at this guy. I think he's cheating. I don't know. One of the instructors there is checking him out or something. But this guy's obviously got the right answers. Everyone's, what's going on? And this is why, guys, beyond just like having to learn something for an AP exam, looking at things like this, I love. Because what happens in your classrooms if you're taking a test and the teacher, for some reason, maybe unbeknownst to you, goes to your neighbor to take a look at what's going on? Everybody else is like, what's happening over there, right? Are we that different from people 1,000 years ago on the other side of the planet? Probably not. And I think that's why this is so worth looking into. But anyway, one area that we are maybe different, maybe not. With the reassertion, and we're going to talk more about gender relations in all of these areas, but we might recall that Confucianism in China, with its 5 relationships, and we remember those 5 relationships, right? Ruler to ruled, and father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, friend to friend. Good job. We remember that those create a strict hierarchy, and much of that hierarchy relies on gender differences, the husband over the wife, right? This, in the Neo-Confucian era of the Tang Dynasty, is going to manifest itself in the growing popularity of a practice known as foot binding. This starts with the rich. Guys, fashion statements typically start with rich people. All right? And then they start doing it, and then all of us regular folks look at it and go, oh yeah, that looks all right, we'll start doing that ourselves. So this is absolutely an aristocratic thing, which will see some expansion into the lower classes. All right? Foot binding is literally that. From a young age, a young girl's foot will be wrapped and bound tightly in cloth to have her foot achieve this unnatural shape of a lotus flower. All right? Because that was seen as appealing by obviously whom?
The man.
Yeah, okay. And guys, let's not get all too high and mighty and look at this as, it's so disgusting. Because do women in our advanced and civilized Western culture do things to distort or, in some cases, destroy their bodies because they think other people will like how that looks? Absolutely. We can get into that conversation another day, but in China, and for the wealthy aristocratic women who would have this done or would do this does a lot of things. First, it's appealing to men, right? They were going not only for a look of the foot, but for how a woman would have to walk when she was bound like this. And that's her feet in shoes. Here, This really went out of practice in the last 100 years. So there are still some very elderly women in China, like not across the board, but there are still instances of like the last women of China who had their feet bound at a very young age. So this would have been a photograph from the early 20th century showing what happens as those bones are broken and dysmorphed in the process of foot binding. So think about it. Not only would it change the shape of your foot, and like once put in a shoe might be seen as appealing to somebody, but it's also going to change how they walk. And guys, or whatever, you can acknowledge this or not, but do guys sometimes notice how girls walk? Now, well, you guys are all, you're amidst a bunch of teenage boys. I'm sure you don't ever, they don't notice it, but maybe sometimes people will. It maybe is unfortunate, but it's a reality. And so this would give a certain gait, a certain walk to the women who had their feet bound. And this would be seen as appealing. But what would it also do to those women who have had their feet bound like this? What? What's that? Absolutely painful. Can imagine how painful that would be. I shouldn't say that. I can't imagine how painful that would be. So what would you not be doing much? You wouldn't be getting around very much. You wouldn't be able to leave the house very much, right? You wouldn't have your husband concerned that you're gallivanting about town when he's not keeping his eye on you, right? So it very much restricts these women to their homes. And I don't know if there's a better example of the patriarchal system of world history in general, or China specifically, than the institution of feet binding. But again, guys, we have a television show specifically devoted to the plastic surgery that people have to make them look different today. And people today destroy themselves and sometimes kill themselves to achieve a certain look. So before we judge too harshly what Chinese women were doing or having done to them 1,000 years ago, I think we need to look into our own mirror today. All right. Of course, we see a rise of the Tang. We will see a fall of the Tang. And with the fall of the Tang, we get another dynasty. Yes, sir?
Just want to, you see, at 907, the Tang
Yeah.
falls, but not until 960 the song comes back up.
Yeah.
It's called the 5 Dynasty and 10 Kingdoms era, where everything is decentralized and nothing.
It all falls apart again.
And I just want to point something real quick.
Yes, please.
This part, it becomes called the Kingdom of South Han.
Okay.
And as you can see, until the fall of the Tang, we still have the Vietnam still under Chinese domination. But in 1938, we actually gained independence for the first time, and that's why in Song Dynasty didn't include Vietnam.
Excellent.
So
Well, thank you.
after 1,000 years of...
Now, I hope you're absolutely cool with being on camera there. Okay, awesome. But thank you for that. So in the year 960, after a few decades of decentralization, we get the rise of another Chinese dynasty, the Song Dynasty. Sui Tang Song, now we're there. And they will be ruling a much smaller than the Tang Dynasty and less centralized kingdom than their predecessors. But they'll rule for about 300 years, 960 to 1279. Again, that's a long time in the scope of world history. The Song Dynasty. About 300 years, 960 to 1279. Never as politically or militarily as strong or as unified as the Tang Dynasty. And that ultimately proves their decline, as the Song Dynasty will not be able to keep out northern nomadic raids. But this time, it's one that you guys have all heard of, and that's the Mongols. Okay, so in the late 1200s, Mongol armies will breach the Great Wall and will ultimately bring the Song Dynasty to a fall. A little highlight of what's going to come at the end of the week, when the Mongols take over China. When the Mongols take over China, it's actually going to be a grandson of Genghis Khan, a guy named Kublai Khan. When the Mongols take over China, they're going to adopt a lot of Chinese culture and custom, and they're going to adopt a Chinese name. So the Yuan dynasty in China, that is the Mongol dynasty. The Yuan dynasty that takes over from the Song dynasty, that is the Mongol dynasty, just Mongols taking on a Chinese name. Good? Yeah. Collectively, all of the starting with the Sui, but certainly into the Tang and the Song dynasty, these are known as a golden age in Chinese history. Expansion, all those things that declined when the Han dynasty fell, they're going to grow during this time period of relative peace and harmony. Expansion of art and science, philosophy, poetry, literature, technological advancements, new navigation techniques and devices to aid travel on the seas and on the rivers. Paper making, printing presses, things that are non-existent in Western Europe. Gunpowder. Where do all of your fireworks come from?
China.
China. This is the dawn of fireworks in China.
Just where, like, all this was
So,
part of the song.
yeah, and Song Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty, because what we get during those two dynasties, we get 300 years, relatively speaking, 300 years each. Round about 600 to round about 900, round about 900 to round about 1200. About 300 years each of relative peace and harmony and centralization. Where people can then, rather than focusing on how they're going to protect themselves or their land, they can go to other endeavors. All right? So this is seen as a golden age in Chinese history.